be looking at Chinese brush painting, especially its cultural politics and its international one-upmanship with painting done in the West. I'm real excited about this presentation because I've grown to be interested in Chinese brush painting and Chinese art history. If you're like me, if you had a classical education, you probably didn't get a lot of education in terms of Chinese history, Chinese art history, Chinese philosophy. And it wasn't until I was an adult and took some classes and some seminars in the art of Chinese brush painting that I really became interested and curious about painting in the East. So I thought we'd spend some time with this today. All right. Well, there are 3 points that I'd really like you to remember about Chinese brush painting. And the first point is that the Chinese were interested in painting things as naturally and as realistically as possible. We call this naturalism in painting, and it was the norm between 200 BCE to roughly 1000 CE. And what I mean by naturalism is painting so that what you're looking at is indistinguishable from the painted work. In the West, we sort of, I think, gravitate toward the term realism, but naturalism, I think, is a better fit for the term painting in a way that represents the image as honestly as possible. So let me show you some examples of this. Here's an early classical Chinese brush painting of a landscape. You can see that when we're looking at this painting, objects in the distance seem to be lighter, seem to be more obscured than the objects closer to us. And this creates an illusion of depth. And when artists do this, it's called using atmospheric perspective. So objects in the foreground have less atmosphere between us, the viewer, and the object. As the objects go further back in space, they tend to be more obscured by the additional atmosphere between us and the object. So objects in the distance are hazier and lighter than objects closer up. We can definitely see that in this example. Notice how the trees and the structure in the foreground are painted in much higher contrast than the mountains, especially the mountains in the distant background. Here's another example of atmospheric perspective. Notice how in this particular painting the artist uses the brushwork to paint as honestly as possible the appearance of the rocks and of the foliage. This is an example of painting that was done probably around 800 or 900 CE. Now, another way that artists create the illusion of depth is by using a technique called foreshortening. So what foreshortening is it's like perspective on objects. Notice in this boat on a river that the bow of the boat, the front of the boat, is in front of the stern and positioned in a way that the front is closer to us than the back of the boat in a sort of foreshortened way. For example, if you were looking at a person straight on with arms stretched out to the sides, that'd be a relatively easy thing to draw or render. But if you moved those arms coming toward the viewer, how do you actually show that? It's a little bit more sophisticated, a little bit more difficult to pull off. Just to show you how difficult it is, I'm going to show you some pictures of boats on a river that were done by Western artists close to the same time period. Look at these manuscript illuminations, and you can see that the artists were either ignorant of the illusion of depth or really had no interest in showing any kind of naturalism or depth, because on the image on the right, the boats aren't overlapping each other. They're stacked on top of each other like cordwood. And the boat on the left in that illumination, you're seeing just a very easy side view. There's no foreshortening going on here at all. So the Chinese figured this out, centuries before Western artists were aware of the idea of foreshortening. In this particular painting by Fan Quan, Travelers by Streams and Mountains at the Berkeley Museum of Art, done approximately 960, it's a traditional early Chinese brushwork painting where atmospheric perspective is used, and the artist is interested in rendering the objects, the trees, the rocky cliffs, the mountains, as realistically and as honestly as possible. One thing I find interesting is the title, Travelers by Streams and Mountains. Well, gee, where the heck are the travelers? You have to look very, very closely. In fact, they're almost invisible. There they are, right in the lower right-hand corner. I'll show you a detail of this painting. Here you can see them in the very, very extreme lower right corner that are cropped off at the image. But look at how beautifully and how much attention to detail, honest detail, that the artist was using in the picturing, in the picturing of these trees and the rocks and the boulders and the streams. It is as if you were right there, enjoying the majesty of this landscape. To find something similar in the West, you have to go to the 19th century. And I've chosen Thomas Cole's The Oxbow, a work done within the Hudson River School period of American painting. Here we see an explorer who is in between the nooks and crannies of a boulder, right in the bottom of the painting. You can see his pack just to the right. But the emphasis here is on the majesty and the sublime beauty of the landscape, not so much the individual. I think both artists are interested in the power and showing the beauty of the natural landscape. The only difference is that the Thomas Cole painting is done, 1,000 years after the painting that I showed you previously. So the first thing to recap is that naturalism is the norm in Chinese painting, up to about 1,000. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. At about 1,000, Chinese painting shifts toward a movement that is about self-expression and individual creativity, rather than drawing, painting, and drafting images so that they look exactly as they do naturally. And this goes from about 1,000 all the way in a Western reference to, I'd say, the end of the Baroque era, early end of the 18th century. So let's see an example of this new style of painting by a Chinese artist. Here is Mu Chi Facheng's 6 Persimmons at the Berkeley Museum. I've seen this painting actually in real life. It's remarkable. Done about 1260. Well, Mu Chi here has painted 6 pieces of fruit, 6 persimmons, but in doing so has completely eliminated the idea of space or perspective. The fruit are painted quickly with a brush stroke, repeating its stroke in the stems of the persimmons, and then the fruit bodies themselves done with different washes of ink. There's no reference to sitting on a table. There's no attention paid to space at all. And this is the artist's choice. The artist has decided not to be concerned with that and only with the brushstroke. Now I'm going to show you something that was done in Europe 100 or 2 years after that. Here is Lawrence Krine's still life with a view. What is the artist interested in here? Well, the artist is definitely interested in space and depth. You can tell because, look, he painted a landscape outside the window that goes back for several miles. And the artist is interested in rendering the images of the fruit as realistically and as naturally and honestly as possible, which was not Mucci's interest at all. In fact, to get even close to the idea of painting ignoring depth in Western art doesn't come until the 20th century. And I'm thinking specifically of Henri Matisse's Red Room. Look at the fruit sitting on the table. Well, what table? It's not even clear where the table begins or ends because Matisse is not interested in depth. Matisse is interested in just color and shape on flat planes. If we take a look at the fruit, there's no shadows on the table. There's no shadows on the fruit, just like there's no shadows or on the fruit or in space with Mucci's work. Again, very similar to the Matisse. The only difference is in about 1,000 years earlier, this idea was thought about by Chinese artists. Really fascinating. So this movement at about 1000 CE toward painting using brushstroke and individual creativity is an interesting idea. In fact, brushstrokes were seen by artists and those who enjoyed the work of these literati artists as expressions of their own creativity, as expressions of their spirit, rather than creating realistic depictions or focusing on complex compositions. It's all about the brushstroke and the artist's individual creativity using their unique brushstroke. Now, in a class that I took on Chinese brush painting at the U, my professor broke down the styles during this change to sort of two schools of thought. You have the literati style and the court style. Let me show you the difference between the two. Literati style, and that's the style that I'm going to be talking about during this presentation, deals with brush and ink, deals with poetry. The court style is more interested in color and creating realistic, beautiful renditions of nature. And the court style would be shown in court, in public, for public view and public consumption, whereas the literati style was more interested in individual expression and not so much with public viewing. So the literati style was interested in mixing poetry, painting, and calligraphy, the three things that were learned in schools at this time and held as in high esteem. So creating the painting and then showing the artist's skill in calligraphy with a poem accompanying the work is what you would see frequently in this literati style of painting that became popularized after 1000 CE. Again, it's not interested in naturalism. It's not for public consumption. It is for individual consumption, individual use. The literati artists would show these paintings off to their friends and family, to colleagues, and they would then put their work up for display for smaller groups to view, and people would marvel at the techniques that the individual artist would use in their brushstrokes. The brushstroke being really what is ultimately important in this painting style. So let's take a look at some of the masters in literati style painting in China. The first would be Suchet, and I have a couple paintings here of landscapes, and you can tell immediately, especially when you look at the one in the lower left, that this is a individual creative interpretation of a landscape, where the interest is not at all into painting it as it is, but as the artist interprets it. And a couple of quotes from Suchet, some of my favorite quotes. The one here I will read to you. Suchet says, "If anyone discusses painting in terms of resemblance, his understanding is nearly that of a child." So Suchet is saying here, children are interested in making paintings look real. We should not be as mature adults. We should be more interested in looking at painting in terms of expressing one's individual spirit. Suchet goes on to say, citing a friend, "I write only to express my heart. I paint only to suit my mind. It is unique, it is creative, and it is individualized." One last work by Suchet, Wood and Rock, done at about 1000 CE. What you notice when you look at this brush painting is that it's a weathered old gnarled tree and then a boulder right next to it. Now, the viewer of this would know immediately what this symbolizes. The tree has been through a lot. It's been through storms, it's been through weather and time, is crooked and gnarled. The rock is weathered, but both are still standing. Both are there, and that message would have come out loud and clear to anyone looking at this painting. But I think what's interesting about this work is look at how Suchet paints the boulder. What a unique way to apply the ink via the brushwork to create the image of a boulder. Never seen one like it. Moving along, I have now the work of Shen Zhou, poet. You look at the brushwork and you might say, oh my goodness, look, it looks so impressionistic. It looks almost like pointillism, like just dots to represent foliage. And that's the beauty of this new style. This is Shen Zhou's unique interpretation of the painting of the rocks, of the painting of the trees, and of the hillside. If I put a comparison to earlier pre-literati style, you see that the artist is interested in showing, the depth, but more so the actual naturalism of the objects. That's not what Shen Zhou is interested in here. Now, if we can grab a translation of the poem, I will read it to you. The poem says, "White clouds sash-like wrap mountain wastes. The rock terrace flies in space. Distant a narrow path. Leaning on a bramble staff, far and free I gaze. To the warble of a valley brook I will reply, whistling." A beautiful poem next to a beautiful creative painting. In the West, we'd have to go back, or forward rather, to the Romantic era. And I'm going to show you Caspar David Friedrich's Wander Above the Mists, done in 1818, where we have a nice German gentleman with a staff on a mountaintop surveying the grandeur and the majesty of the jagged peaks with the atmospheric perspective displayed beautifully as objects go back into space. And please forgive me for doing this, but I'm going to read Shen Zhou's poem superimposed on this painting because I think it matches. White cloud sash-like wrap mountain wastes, the rock terrace flies in space, distant a narrow path. Leaning on a bramble staff, far and free I gaze. To the warble of a valley brook I will reply, whistling. Was Friedrich aware of Shenzhou's painting wander above the mists? I do not know. What I do know is that he was aware of Chinese classical brush painting. And whether he was influenced or not by Shenzhou's wander above the mists, I don't know, but I would like to think there was a connection there. The only difference between the two, again, is that Shenzhou's painting is much more expressionistic and done about 300 years earlier. Dong Qicheng, another one of the literary painters who was really super creative and expressive in his brushwork. Check out, I want you to look at this. Look at the pine trees behind the structures. And you look at them closely and it's, oh my gosh, it's just cross-hatching. What an interesting way, I wish I'd thought of that, of how to represent a group of pine trees. Super unique. As is his rendering of mountains in this particular painting. Talk about pointillism. Wait, when was this done? This is done again in the 17th century. A couple hundred years before pointillism became an issue and a scene on Western painting. Very unique, very creative master, as is Shi Tao. In fact, I love Shi Tao's work a lot. His work almost reminds me of that quality. Perhaps you used straw to blow around blops of ink on a piece of paper. You get a very unique quality of ink trailing, and that's sort of what his work reminds me of. Just just so unique. It's unmistakable. Shi Tao painting. But what I like even more than his painting is some of his writings, which I would recite to some of my painting and drawing students, and you'll see why in a second here. Let me put an instruction on painting by Shi Tao up. He says and advises us in painting, standing amidst a sea of ink, firmly establish your views. Determine your life beneath the tip of the brush. In the space of a foot, transfigure style, and within the chaos, liberate new light. And then here's the good part. Then, even if the ink fails to come to life, even if your brush is dead, even if the painting doesn't work, at least the me in it still remains. I love that. I love that. When I saw students struggling, I'd pull this Shi Tao quote out, and hopefully that would make them feel better about their emerging works. Next is the artwork of Badashanran, who was a royalty, actually, a prince in a kingdom of China. And he had a reputation of being mad or insane. I don't know whether that's true or whether he was faking it because, if you can convince people that you're mad, they'll probably leave you alone, which was probably what he wanted in his painting. But look at this. Oh my gosh. Look at this landscape of building structure overlapped by trees and mountains. You take away the structure and it almost looks like an abstract painting. This is crazy. This is wild. And the date on this is in the 18th century, late 17th century. Take a look at this Badashanran. Flowers in a Jar, 1680. Oh my! As it's such a quick and beautiful rendering of a jar with flowers in it. Let me show you another painting of jars and flowers done in 1682 by Klaas Hedde, a Dutch still life master, done almost at the exact same time. Isn't it interesting how different these works are? With Badashanran, we have a Chinese painter who has chosen an interpretation based on loose brushwork, where the Klaas Hedde is interested in showing and rendering the still life exactly or as close to reality, painstakingly painting every minute detail. The difference couldn't be more outrageous, in my opinion. Now, this brings to us an issue of cultural politics and one-upmanship. Because China and Europe were well acquainted with each other. In the 17th century, there was a lot of trade going on. There were missionaries going back and forth. So there were opinions on each other's painting styles and traditions. So let me read to you a couple of quotes, one by a European, one by a Chinese artist. The first quote I'm going to read to you is by Matteo Ricci, who was a Jesuit missionary to China, spent a lot of time in China, a lot of time going back and forth, and he has some opinions on Chinese painting, and here they are. He says, Matteo Ricci does, in 1605, the Chinese use pictures extensively, but in the production of these, they have not at all acquired the skill of Europeans. They know nothing about the art of painting in oil or the use of perspective in their paintings, with the result that their productions are likely to resemble the dead rather than the living. Oh, well, I think Ricci was not at all familiar with or wasn't thinking of, I don't know, Van Quan's painting of 960, where perspective is being used, atmospheric perspective, foreshortening, and very much in the realist tradition. I'm sure that Ricci was thinking of Badashanran or other literati painters that were taking great liberties of creativity with their works, which were not appreciated, apparently, by Ricci. Well, let's take a look at what a Chinese artist has to say about Western painting. Wu Li, an artist and philosopher, teacher in China at the same time that Ricci was going back and forth, says of Western art, he says, our painting values originality, not resemblance. We call this inspired and free. Their painting is all about shading, volume, and resemblance, and is achieved by laboriously following convention. Ooh, well, that pretty much nails it right there. We see the two sides sort of in a competition, a critique of each other's art traditions, and each other's art traditions are not completely appreciated very well. Nonetheless, you have to admit that when we look at a Badashanran painting, here his garden landscape, all references made to the natural world are pretty much gone. It's basically a pure abstraction. It's not about trying to convince the viewer that they are in front of a scene, a garden landscape. What this is about is creating a sense of emotion that's displayed and communicated by the use of brushstroke. And that's what's most important to the literati style Chinese painters during this time period. Looking at a Western work of garden painting, I chose Fragonard's Blind Man's Bluff, where we see a garden with people frolicking in naughty ways in the garden. Uh, yeah, the naughty things happened in gardens during the Rococo in in Western painting, but you can see that the artist is interested in showing depth and in showing the garden, how it looks. That is not what Bhattacharya's interested in here at all. In fact, if we want to find something similar in Western art, we have to go all the way to the mid 20th century, and let's compare Bhattacharya's work to Jackson Pollock's Untitled of 1951. And the fact that it was done on Japanese rice paper, I think, is telling. Yes, Jackson Pollock was aware of Chinese painting, of Asian brush painting done in previous centuries. How could he not be to paint a painting like this? I mean, it looks just like the Bhattacharya's of 1680, again, done 300 plus years earlier. Now, the thing about Jackson Pollock and the New York School painters that were mid-century modernists is that they were referred to as the abstract expressionists. And if you have learned anything about abstract expressionism and mid-20th century modernism, you know that the whole point of the abstract expressionist movement is to communicate emotion through brushstroke. And each painter had their unique style of brushstroke. I find it so interesting that this is exactly what Chinese literati style painters were interested in 300 years earlier. Crazy. Now, the third issue I want you to remember about Chinese brush painting is this. The late 19th, early 20th century, modernism presented to Chinese painters a real aesthetic and cultural problem. And the problem is this. If you're a Chinese painter in the 20th century, the early to mid 20th century, and if you want to participate in this international idea of modernism and the avant-garde, you've got a problem. And the problem is this. Traditional Chinese painting is all about brushstroke and individual creativity. So if you want to paint something that's modernist and avant-garde, it doesn't really work to paint in the traditional, Chinese method, because that's 300 years old. And something that is 300 to 600 years old isn't really avant-garde, if you know what I mean. But if you go back and reject that and rework sort of any of this post-Renaissance naturalism, that would be considered sort of passé. So this is a real problem. What do you do if you are a 20th century Chinese artist? You really only got 3 possible responses to this international modernist challenge. You could do one of 3 things. You could either A, copy Western modernism, B, or 2, blend post-Renaissance naturalism with Chinese brush techniques, or 3, the last thing that you could possibly do is sort of rework the modernist features of traditional Chinese painting to create something that pushes it further and therefore being avant-garde. So I'll show you examples of all 3 of these possible solutions. Here's the first one, imitating Western modernism, Lin Fang's Four Beauties, done in 1935. Well, when I see this painting, I immediately think of another European modernist, Modigliani, who did countless portraits of women, elongating their features, stylizing their facial features. It really reminds me a lot of Lin Fang's Four Beauties. Now, whether you're attracted to this kind of work, that's okay. I'm not going to make any judgments. Instead, I'm going to take a look at the next thing that Chinese painters could do, and that is blending post-Renaissance naturalism with Chinese brushwork. as we see here with Shi Beihong in horses, done in the early 20th century. We see beautifully rendered, foreshortened horses done with Chinese brushwork. Sort of reminds me of Delacroix's Arabian Stable of 1820. Very nicely done, both paintings, but neither painting really could be considered avant-garde because it's drawing and mimicking upon the past. Now, I forgot to mention there is one other option for Chinese painters, and that's painting in the style of the Cultural Revolution propaganda posters that were ubiquitous mid-century China. These posters, you've seen them before, very familiar, very much like the Soviet propaganda posters of the Stalinist era. We even had artists in the West sort of latch onto this style pre-World War II. But that's not what I want to talk about. I want to talk about the third option Chinese artists had, and that was reworking traditional Chinese brush painting, but pushing it further. And here is an artist that I think really succeeds at doing this beautifully. Cheng Da-jin, Summer Mountains, is, I think, a masterpiece in this third option. So this painting, which shows a landscape, but yet the ink wash and the colors are pushed further than we've seen in the centuries prior to this. It reminds me really of the work of Willem de Kooning with his broad paint and brush strokes. It reminds me of Helen Frankenthaler's abstract expressionist color field paintings, where you've got these blotches of color that just move effortlessly through the canvas. Cheng Da-jin's paintings have that same quality as color field painting in the West, yet it's building upon the Chinese cultural heritage of freedom and brushstroke. It's just pushing it even further, even to the point of pure abstraction. Look at Cheng Da-jin's Glacial Mountains in the Mist, 1963. It's a masterpiece of full abstraction. I could just look at it forever. It's just such a beautiful work. Again, taking traditional Chinese painting techniques and pushing it so that it is avant-garde. A really nice solution to this problem of trying to be modernist and avant-garde when you were painting that way all along. Now, the last painting I'm going to show you today is by one of my former students, Irene Wei. Here's a work that she did as a senior in my class, Painting, Drawing, Printmaking, in 2014. It's called Paper Mountains. Here, Irene was interested in traditional Chinese brush painting. I showed her the work of Bada Shanren. She was also interested in the very traditional art of Chinese paper cut work and cutting, and you can see she created a landscape, a rocky landscape of mountain rocks morphing into crystals, and these cut pieces of paper then were glued to the ink wash painting, creating a layer effect of landscape that takes these two traditional Chinese painting methods and creates something that's very new, very fresh, almost something that's postmodern. I just was so delighted by this painting when Irene finished it in the end of her senior year in 2014. Well, That's it, folks. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope all of you are well. I hope all of you are happy and healthy and continue to be so through the rest of the summer. I'll see you again, maybe at the end of August or early September. Bye now.